Africa. Now, Nigeria in particular, our coastline stretches over 853 kilometer stretch. And the major cities along the coastal areas are Lagos, Calabar, I forgot to mention Port Harcourt. And 9 out of 37 states are located in coastal areas of Nigeria. And the coastal area happens to be 25% of coastal area happen to be the inhabitant of 25% of Nigeria's population, reside in coastal areas. And these states located along our coastal areas include Lagos, Ogun, Ondo, Rivers, Delta, Bayelsa, Akwa Ibom, and Edo. We have also Cross River. And this map on the right just shows, because I'll be making reference to Niger Delta areas along the coastal area. So we have about 9 states that fall under the Niger Delta area. We call them oil-producing states. So now we'll go to coastal population and livelihoods. Of course, it's, as we said, 25% of the population of the country reside in coastal areas. So it's a densely populated area, specifically because it's a hub for industrial and economic activities. And also you have a number of institutions, multinationals, and industries located in coastal area. Interestingly, 60% of non-oil income revenue is obtained from coastal areas, and also Nigerian coastal areas. And also the geographical location of our coastal areas or the coastal states make them vulnerable to climate change. We have a number of ocean resources and livelihood opportunities that are tied to population living along the coastal areas of Nigeria. Such livelihood options include fishing, oil and gas exportation, agriculture, tourism, and shipping. So climate change itself constitutes a threat to coastal development and livelihoods ecosystem in general. And also the severity of climate change on inhabitants of coastal areas will depend on the location of the individuals as well as the socio-economic conditions. So coastal areas are characterized with high exposure, low resilience, and poor. Coastal areas are vulnerable due to the fact that they are highly exposed, and also they have low resilience and due to poor governance in Africa generally. So this puts Africa in a very vulnerable situation in terms of climate change effects on coastal areas. And flooding itself is one of the major climate shock threatening developing countries. And this is basically due to poor planning and coordination of urban areas specifically. And the coastal areas are more vulnerable compared to inland areas to climate change in Nigeria. For example, between 1901 and 2005, in general, the temperature of the country increased by 1.1 degrees centigrade, and rainfall declined on the average by 81 millimeter. However, rainfall in coastal areas increased, and sea level rise also increased, such that it submerged a land area of about 3,100 kilometers square. And also, still on the livelihoods, coastal flooding and erosion are very common in Nigeria. And between 1993 and 2010, it was projected by IPCC that global sea level rise will rise by 3.2 millimeters yearly. And this is expected to increase submergence and also coastal erosion and coastal flooding. We're expected to have more acidification, warming of coastal waters, and threats to coastal population and assets. 2017 recorded the warmest temperature in terms of surface temperature globally, the third warmest rather. Then human activities are expected to worsen the effect of coastal population. Human activities like they're expected to worsen the effect of climate change on coastal population and ecosystem. Human activities like deforestation, for example. Then we have fish population and fishery ecosystem will also be altered, especially when you have infiltration of salt water into inland waterways. As such, we may lose some of the fish species. The migration in West Africa is largely interregional. That means within most of the migrants in West Africa, they migrate within West African countries. And this is driven mainly by search for economic opportunities and strong network among member countries. And next, we look at the trend and patterns of migration. Now, the drivers of migration vary. It depends on pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial. The pre-colonial period was, the migration was mainly driven by search for fertile lands and secured places to live. Whereas the post-colonial and colonial period was mainly, migration was mainly driven by economic and political development. Now young people, the young population dominate African migration. And the median age as at 2007 of migrants, African migrants, was 31 years. Men and women do migrate, but men stay longer, and the duration of stay is usually between 5 to 7 years. We also have that uneven development is responsible for migration in Nigeria. Now, rural-urban migration is more dominant in terms of migration, and most of the people engaged in rural migration, rural to urban migration are the educated, the young, and the unmarried. We have other forms of migration. We have rural to rural migration, urban to rural migration, urban to urban migration, and urban to urban migration. Now, rural out migration mainly is driven by poverty, low crop yield, and access to education and health care, and inadequate access to education and health care. Now, Nigerian international migrants, most of those who migrate out of Nigeria normally move to countries like Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, most of the migrants. And the average departure age of these migrants is 24 years for male and then 21 years for females. Then also generally Nigeria is a destination for most African immigrants. So rural to urban migration is driven by poor or inadequate social amenities. Rural to rural migration is driven by search for opportunities such as fertile lands. And we also have the case of urban to rural migration in Oyo State, which was mainly driven by high cost of living and unemployment situation. So we also have coastal to inland migration and inland to coastal migration, which is a big concern for climate change impact on migration. But generally in Nigeria, coastal to inland migration is not common. What is common is inland to coastal migration because of the opportunities available in coastal areas of Nigeria. Then migration, whether it is induced by, whether induced by climate or not, differs by gender or group. In 2010, the 51% of the migrants, internal migrants specifically, were females. And this got across 21 states. We also have male return migrants, 61.3%, and then female return migrants, 38.7%. Migration itself can serve as a strategy for adaptation to climate change, both for men and women. And mostly people migrate due to marriage or family unification. Most of the internal migration by women specifically is due to marriage and family unification. Then the mean age of female migrants is lower than the mean age of the male migrants. So we look at climate change and migration nexus. We know that 97% of Lake Chad, a good example is 97% of Lake Chad, which is lost to climate change. And then drought is the most significant of all the climate-related, climate-induced migration. Climate refugees too have also increased significantly. And you have anthropogenic activities also contributing to climate change in this area. Then we can see climate change impact on ecosystem either directly or indirectly. Sorry. Okay, climate-induced migration impact on coastal ecosystem. We have submergence of coastal areas due to more coastal erosion and flooding. Also, we have negative effect of coastal on coastal livelihood and development of coastal communities. And we also have, I talked about it, infiltration of salt water into inland waterways. Fish population and fishery ecosystem too is also expected to be affected. And then we have high possibility that water for agricultural purpose will also be scarce. Then land resources, biodiversity, and terrestrial resources will also be impacted. Then small farm holders may also lose their income due to low yield, and they may be forced to migrate. Then you have enormous impact of migration on agriculture and food security in Nigeria. So rural-urban migration will also be a major challenge for agriculture in the Niger Delta states. Then haven't itemized all the issues discussed. I will conclude by saying that to boost coastal adaptation, there's need to boost coastal adaptation and management of coastal resources. Therefore, incentives should be given to communities to boost them to relocate from high-risk areas to low-risk areas. And also there's need for more investment in coastal adaptation because the net benefit of coastal adaptation far outweighs the cost of non-adaptation. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks so much.
Is that all right? So thank you very much, Yusuf, Mr. Yusuf. So are you disappearing on me? Getting his pad. So this was a good first effort, and I understand you're at the early stages of your dissertation research, and as such, I recognize that it's a work in progress. Here are some thoughts that I have for you. First of all, I think that the line of research is very important. I've done some separate work for USAID where we did mapping of coastal exposure in the entire West African coastline. And clearly the delta area of Nigeria is one of the most affected by potential sea level rise. But I don't think it receives nearly the same attention that Bangladesh has received. So while we have probably at least tens, if not 20s, if not hundreds of studies on potential migration impacts of sea level rise in Bangladesh, I've seen very few careful studies of analysis of migration out of the coastal zone of Nigeria. So it's a big deficit, and hopefully your study will contribute to that. That said, I think that there are some weaknesses in your approach. For one, I have a PDF, or I have your study, the document, and I've actually made some edits to it, and I've added some references that I think you should look up and insert in your work. I think you need a clear definition of vulnerability. Either adopt the IPCC definition, which is essentially what we call outcome vulnerability. So it's a combination of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity, or adapt something like the contextual vulnerability, which is essentially a political economy approach, which looks at communities and their resources. It's essentially about communities' sensitivity or susceptibility to climate change. But you need to adopt one or the other and be clear about which one you're adopting. There's a fairly wide literature, not a huge number, but I know of 4 studies at least that look at sea level rise, coastal impacts in coastal Nigeria, and you haven't cited any of them, so I put them in your document. The other comments I have include you don't really talk about what the adaptation solutions are. So you say that there should be more investment in adaptation, but I have no idea what you mean in that context. It's one thing to throw up seawalls around Lagos, which is obviously extremely valuable real estate, and nobody wants to see that go underwater. But it's another thing to try to protect the vast swaths of mangrove swamp in the Niger Delta. So what does it mean to do coastal adaptation in this context? Are we talking about one form of adaptation is actually retreat. So are you talking about retreat as an option? And if it's managed retreat, how do you do that? How do you relocate villages successfully? You made some statements, and I've highlighted the portions of the paper where you're vague. You don't cite evidence. You don't cite actual, let's see, I think it's one point you say that there's evidence that there have been people migrating out of the Delta, but you don't say where, when, how, whose research proved this. So there really wasn't any there. No evidence that in fact that is in fact occurring. Finally, I'll just say that, finally I just think you need to think about what it is to collect more data in this context. I don't know if your next phase is to do field work, but I think it is sorely needed, and it would be very good, at the very least, to go out into the field and collect people's perceptions of how seaward impacts are affecting them, say, on a daily basis, and whether they're giving any consideration due to increased flood risk, or, as you say, saltwater intrusion or other things, to possible relocation or moving out, how it's affecting their livelihoods, whether it's fishing communities or those that depend on mangrove resources or those that are involved in the oil industry or other things. So it would be, I think, a critical contribution to literature, but you still have some way to go. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Now, Maman Bello. Okay, it's your time. 15 minutes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Chairperson. Well, thank you. I'm going to present a topic of my paper I titled Socioeconomic and Environmental Triggers of Agriculture Actors Conflicts and How to Build Peace Among These Actors. Actually, the topic is because we said in the Sahel at large, terrorism is something that is new for them. So linking terrorism to climate change will be very tough work for us. And we choose the farmer-herders conflict because that's what is easily linked to climate. So we really work on that, and here is the plan of my presentation. In introduction, we've said that all across the Sahel, the current situation is mirrored with armed conflict in general and intercommunal violence escalation in particular. And hence, conflict between agriculture actors, we define them as farmers and herders, has been there for, say, lifetime. But fundamentally, it involves dispute over land and water access. And countries like Niger, where geographical conditions like is arable land, rapid population growth, and climate conditions naturally harsh, then if climate change resulting with variability of climate parameters is going to hamper agropastoralism, therefore food security. The problem we investigated in the paper is that in Niger, as in the wider part of Sahel, these conflicts have grown more violent in recent time. So the idea is to redress their grievances. Individuals, when they assume that resources are scarce, are not enough for them to share with their partners, which are farm herders, then they are likely to fight over the remaining resources, which is being impacted more and more by climate change. So the objective of the paper is to assess triggers of farmer-herder conflict escalation in Niger and ways to build peace among these actors. The method we use, Mr. Chairperson, is that we adopt a Heckman two-stage model, in the sense that we formulated the problem to be that a farmer or a herder has to judge first that his resource is not enough for him to live. How about sharing it with others? So at the second stage, after he observed or he perceived this scarcity, then he will decide or not to fight or to find another means to cope with it. So to give rise, which automatically arise the problem of selectivity, because it's only those who perceive the scarcity who are likely to fight or not. Here is the formulation. The first step, that's the resource scarcity selection model, and the second one, we didn't put the equations just for us to go fast, and the conflict selection model. Professor Chairperson, here is the presentation, the map of Niger showing the areas we've covered. We actually covered the 7 regions out of 8 administrative regions. We excluded Niamey because of disorganized urbanization. We cannot say Niamey is having land for farming or even for herding. So apart from Niamey, we covered the whole country in terms of that. And as for the data we use, it is collected on about 3,000 farmers and herders combined. And here are just for the study area, just for an automatic show, is how they are ranked in the literature that Difa, Dosso, Maradi, and Niger as a total, how animal productions are and cereal productions and fishery, just to give some figures on the importance of those regions we considered as a whole for the country's agriculture production. And the result still on descriptive statistics, we were able that in general, in Niger Republic, farmers and herders' ability to adapt is limited by their lack of economic and technical resources, and their vulnerability is accentuated by heavy dependence on the climate because of a rain-fed system, diseases, pests, and post-harvest loss. So through the survey, we were able to understand that those who are reporting that they have no measures of adaptations, they are waging 16%. But importantly, to go straight, is people, some of them are saying, how are they coping with the reduction of resources? They will tell you, well, if things are not enough, we are ready to fight for that. So we got 14%, 11% for that. And some are combining, if you are a farmer, you are raising livestock, and if you are a herder, you are doing farming, they are up to 14% of that. And the model, the Heckman model we ran is we use variable, though in the paper we define these variables, but here actually the household head age, the first stage model we were able to capture that parameters or helping a farmer or a herder to perceive the scarcity are their household age, and household size, and their extensions. They are all contributing positively to the probability for a farmer or a herder to perceive the scarcity. Then from there, we took it to the model of conflict model, which is now, we realize that the household head age and the household head educational level, even the household size, they are all contributing positively to the probability of a conflict between these actors to escalate. Here is what I just tried to explain, the household size and the household age, the level of education. Yeah. And as many scholars have shown, the per capita income is significantly and negatively correlated to conflict potential. That's what I earlier explained by resources in this, on this table. I'm sorry that, yes, by resources. Then one of our variable of interest, which is scarcity, is positively and significantly correlated to conflict escalation. It means people, when they lack basic needs, they become frustrated and they are willing to fight in order to redress their grievances. This is the Homer Dixon and other researchers who are supporting this hypothesis main finding. So our result is conformed to that. And lastly, Mr. Chairperson, for building peace, we were able only there to conduct a survey on 3 regions to capture from those farmers and herders. From them, what is the problem and how are they solving issues when they are raised? And we were able to understand that in Niger, there are 3 ways to deal with such conflicts when they are occurring. The first step is to use the customary conciliation procedures. The second is the official procedures, and the last one is to use local tools for conflict management. The customary one is just to initiate when a farmer or a herder got damage from his partner, then they will initiate, he will first complain, Second thing, they will prepare to see what is the damage caused. And the third one is to see the negotiation. But importantly for this phase of negotiation is to apply the relationship to joke. We call it parenté à plaisanterie in French. People will joke. Farmers, well, Fulani, they are always arguing or joking with like kanuri. It exists, and sometimes they will tell you it is end and you will accept it like that. So the second one is official, and the last one is local tool, just to say this is more of, I don't say mysterious or really very animist. They will dig land. The guilty person will put his hand, they will just narrate some stories, and if you are guilty, your hand cannot be pulled back. So these are those methods. Mr. Chairperson, we draw some policy recommendations based on our results. To build a peaceful society, the work has to be done from the bottom through educating young people from the urban area and even the rural, because we found that educational level is very key in contributing to reduce farmer-herders conflict. And climate change, hence it is hampering the agricultural resources and lead people to fight over the remaining resources instead of cooperating. Government has to encourage and disseminate adaptation measures. And both society and government have to keep developing the relationship to joke. That's what really we recommend. Thank you, Mr. Chairperson.
Okay, thanks so much. Dr. Alex, you have only most.
Yes, well, thank you. It's Garba Ima?
Yes.
Okay. Again, a critical question that needs to be investigated, so I commend you for looking at it. I also commend you for the research that you did on the ground and the statistics, which I think are quite sound. I'm not a statistician, and I had some difficulty at times understanding the need for the Heckman's model. So I think you need to explain that a bit better, to, especially if you plan to publish this. I've made notes, again, in your manuscript, just as I did with the other gentleman, and so I'll give it to you, and you can look at the notes and some of my edits to your English. Overall, I was impressed by your English, by the way, but I think there's some turns of phrase that you could improve. So one of the things that I found myself wondering, first, it wasn't clear to me whether you interviewed solely crop cultivators or whether you also interviewed herders. It also seemed to be implied that only herders are the ones who are guilty of damages to crop producers, but it seems to me that one could also argue that encroachment into traditional grazing lands or traditional passageways for grazing and transhumance communities could actually be considered a damage as well to the herders. So we have a tendency, at least those of us who are sedentary, to consider those who are non-sedentary or pastoralists, especially in the Sahel. I know there's been this bias policy-wise against herders, perhaps a lack of understanding of why they arm themselves because of the fact that they do lose cattle and they need to protect their cattle. It's not solely because they're involved in terrorist activities or things like this. So I think more understanding of what is driving the pastoralists or the herders and what could be done to make their life more easier would be helpful. I think citing some evidence, I've heard anecdotally, and I know it was actually a colleague who does a lot of work with remote sensing, so I don't believe it's purely anecdotal, that in the region of northern Nigeria and in southern Niger, there's been a vast extension of cropland into areas that were previously not cropped. And you mentioned that some herders are also starting to crop as well, and I've heard that's the same in northern Burkina Faso, for instance. So what are the implications now for land tensions and land rights? My conclusion from some of what you wrote was that the traditional usufructuary rights that have been pertain in most of West Africa are starting to break down. In other words, under the pressures that we've seen, now it used to be a land-abundant society. Traditional structures were able to manage disputes over land, but we're now facing a situation where those traditional mechanisms are no longer necessarily going to solve the problems. So things like tête de chien, which sounded very esoteric to me, and probably it's a form of kind of black magic, really. How is this going to resolve a problem in a way that people will agree that this is the solution and everyone walks away happy? I don't see that happening. So I think there's going to need to be better jurisprudence and better policies in this area to manage these conflicts. Dare I go as far as to say maybe cadastres and things like that to establish people's rights to land, although that's probably a long way off. You seem to, you've, I think, understood the causes better, but you haven't really addressed, I think, solutions in a convincing way, so I think I would work on that more. Questions of whether sedentarization of herders or confining livestock to confined areas and bringing forage to them, that's of course what we do in the West, but is not obviously a very common solution here in West Africa. Is it even feasible? Is it even possible? I don't know, but I'm just posing the question. Then at the end you kind of conclude and throw away this throwaway line. I call it a throwaway line. That means a sort of anodyne solution, which is involve populations in making decisions before implementation, but you're not clear on what the decisions are that are being made and how involvement will solve that problem. So I really like your work, so I don't want to be raining on the party, let's put it that way. I think you're doing good work, but I just wanted to refine it a little bit. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now, for the last paper, will be presented by Famagay. So you are also 15 minutes for your presentation.
Don't the presenters get a chance to respond or no? I was worried I might have the last word. It bothered me.
Oui, je pense que c'est bon. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Famagay, and I'm going to present a topic on migration in West Africa. A response has a household vulnerability to climate change. As you can see, it's a work in progress. So I'm just going to make a short presentation to get feedbacks and recommendations. Here we have the content of the presentation. We start with the context of population in West Africa, which is increasing from 96.1 to 2015, from 86 millions to more than 300 millions. And it is projected to increase to more than 400 in 2020 and more than 500 in 2030 and more than 800 in 2050. And the population growth rate is 46 5.2% from 2015 to 2030. And the region of West Africa has the highest intra-regional migration in Africa. And it is estimated that the number of migrants in 2010 was more than 8 million. And the internal migration also was estimated to be more than 58%. And it is noticed that young people are more willing to migrate. We notice also that in economics, different theory and empirical approaches are used to explain migration, and many factors also has been found to be explaining migration, like labor productivity, the wage, economic inequality, and so on. And there is also a lack of economic policy instruments to mitigate or support migration processes. And this fact is because of the complexity of migration phenomenon. So with climate change, the problems and challenges related to migration are acute, and migration is considered by some researchers to be a response to climate change and natural resources degradation. And in this perspective, there are two opposing approaches in the social sciences. The first one considers climate change as the main cause of migration, and this approach is based on alarmist forecasts. And they said that extreme weather events could cause massive displacement of people around the world. And for the second approach, it is considered that migration is a result of several factors, has the promotion of multidisciplinary approaches to better understand the relationship between climate change and migration. It is also noticed that the causes and economic impacts of migration are the most studied in the literature review. The role of climate factors in migration has not been the subject of so much in-depth economics analysis. So the general objective of this study is to analyze the links between climate change and migration in West Africa. So in other words, it will be a question of how far does migration contribute to community adaptation to climate change. For our review, we have two separate points about migration in West Africa. A point which considers migration has an environmental response to climate change, and a second point which considers migration has a decision to allocate household labor. For the method, we use a revenue income maximization for West African regions. And this is the theoretical formalization of the model. And in these models, we have added some climate change factors like precipitation or some extreme events that we can see here. So we have two different kinds of income, rural income and urban income. This is the variables of the model that we have considered. here we have a result that we didn't interpret yet, because our key variables are not included into this regression. So we are just presenting it to get feedbacks from you. This is another method that we have used to estimate our models. So this is what I had to present to you, and I'm sorry because the work is not yet done. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The comment will be done by the chairman. Okay, to be more comfortable, let me speak in French. So, concernant la question sur les migrations, ici, le travail, bien entendu, n'est pas encore fini. Seulement, ce que quand je regarde le titre du travail, je me rends compte que le titre du travail, c'est Climate Change, Vulnerability of Coastal Community and Migration in West Africa. C'est-à-dire que tu tentes d'analyser les migrations à l'intérieur de l'Afrique de l'Ouest. Mais en réalité, quels sont les facteurs qui justifient la migration? Puisque la migration est un phénomène qui existe depuis toujours. On sent bien que les nomades bougeaient à l'intérieur du système. Et bien entendu, il y a des facteurs qu'il faut voir, c'est-à-dire au niveau de l'emploi, parce que les gens ne travaillent pas, ils bougent. Et deuxièmement, au niveau du changement climatique, ça peut faire en sorte que ces derniers bougent. Et il y a la question également de la pauvreté. Donc, il faut tenir compte de la pauvreté, de l'emploi et du changement climatique. La difficulté dans ce travail, c'est de pouvoir identifier ceux qui doivent migrer à cause du changement climatique. Et deuxièmement, lorsqu'ils migrent pour aller vers un autre endroit, est-ce qu'ils ne vont pas créer d'autres problèmes climatiques dans ces différents endroits? C'est-à-dire, est-ce qu'ils ne vont pas mettre la pression sur les ressources naturelles dans ces zones quelquefois appropriées? Donc, il faut regarder. Concernant la régression qui a été faite, on ne sait pas quelles sont les données qui ont été utilisées, on ne sait pas quelle est la base qui a été utilisée. Il faut absolument retrouver la base et il faut présenter vraiment les résultats. Si la question, c'est de savoir est-ce que les migrations constituent une réponse aux vulnérabilités ou bien est-ce que c'est à ça que tu veux répondre vraiment? Bon, c'est un peu complexe, donc il faut en tenir compte. Okay, so that was my comment in French. And now I want to know if somebody else have some comments about the free presentation. Professor? Yes.
I came now from who talked about migration.
Yes.
Some of the triggers of migration. There's one thing I noticed in Nigeria. Most of the universities predominantly are in urban centers. And lots of youths from the ages of 16 and above go to school in those centers. I wonder how many of them return back to the village and how many remain there. Because those may be serious forms of migration. Can we change our educational institution where some of those things can remain closer home so that migration trends can be reduced? I saw the context for which he presented that paper, and that thought came. I teach in the University of Calabar, but I know that a small survey that we did showed that over 80% of the students in that university do not come from that town. And at the end of their studies, if you follow them, where do they go? And it will be a very serious source of struggling to see how you can adapt or mitigate. The jobs back home, like someone said, government cannot give you the jobs. Some of those jobs now, we are supposed to be entrepreneurs, and the resource base is moving back to those areas from which you came from. How are we handling the educational system to make sure that when our students come from those rural areas, they can go back and revamp and empower the rural communities to grow? I think that is a major challenge, and I think that the person should look at it carefully and evolve answers.
Well, I think as simplistic as the observation of Professor is, it has some profound implications to our understanding of population and migration. Like I said in the morning, we find large concentrations of human beings in our cities, and we think that's the population of a country. In the case of Nigeria that he mentioned, and I know quite a number of sub-Saharan African countries, the rural areas have been deserted. And so it's important for us to balance our views of our claim of population growth. We really need to interrogate this further. Like I said in the morning, the figures that many African countries are throwing about, particularly Nigeria, those figures are false. Nigeria's population cannot be up to 200 million. Definitely cannot be up to that. These are inflated figures, and we keep on projecting on the basis of that. In 20 years' time, Nigeria will be 500 million. I don't think that's very correct. It's important that we interrogate these figures further. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My comment is for the second presentation on conflicts. From the I would like to comment on the more the theoretical framing for the paper. Competition for resources and associated conflicts occur all the time, with or without climate change. So if we apply economic concepts, we can think that conflicts are an outcome of a rational cost-benefit analysis, and they occur when benefit costs for fighting are higher than alternative options. Of course, climate change would put pressure on resource availability, but distinguishing it from other pressures on resource availability is very different. And so attributing conflicts to climate change, that's why very difficult, if not impossible. I mean, at least very difficult. So I was wondering if you could look into if climate change would change the benefit-cost ratio calculation for fighting or not fighting among different actors.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Professor Chair, for giving me the floor. My question goes to Mr. Garba, who presented on conflicts. And I would like to know about a specific type of conflict, terrorism, which is going on now in Burkina Faso. According to you, is there any link of climate change to this conflict, to terrorism, which is going on now in Burkina Faso? Because terrorism in the Sahel region, and specifically in Burkina Faso, started in 2014 following the war in Libya. And though during this period, we were already experiencing this resource scarcity is talking about. So my question is now, is there any link of climate change to terrorism? Yeah, I don't know if you follow me well. So my second question is about the procedures to solve conflict. You have cited 3 types of procedures. The first one is customary procedures, and the second one is, I think, local tools, and also official procedures. According to you, what is the most relevant one to solve conflicts in the Sahelan region? Thank you.
Okay. I want to address the way migration is conceptualized in the migration-related papers which we heard. Theoretically, migration has been handled for a long time by concepts of pushing and pulling, and climate change may add to push factors. The more recent theoretical and empirical literature on migration identifies an overarching other factor, and that is relative deprivation. People comparing themselves with other people. As individuals, it was very good that there was gender differentiation in the migration paper, number 1. But this aspect, in the context of the digital world and comparing with other communities, not only in the same country but all over the world, changes migration economic theory and empirics. So in order to empirically assess relative deprivations, so comparing oneself with the others, requires other survey instruments and questioning households, men, women, young, old, about their objectives. The older theory of migration economics has one other important finding, that is, migration decisions are done collectively by the whole households in almost all circumstances, and not only by the individual. So that collective decision-making of economics, of joint contracting implicitly, needs also to be considered. I think the migration papers with these new insights can be pushed in important new directions.
Thanks, Prof. One question for Garba. Okay, take the floor.
Oh, you mean to? Yes. Well, I don't know whether I should. Well, what I'm saying is, thank you very much. Anyway, thank you. Well, I will try to answer, though I will not like. But actually, for the theoretical aspect, I do agree with Dr. Alisher that there is problem of taking it at that point, saying the rational decision. But we based it based on what Pareto, he says in an assertion that human efforts are used for 2 reasons. The first is to produce, extend, and get benefit. The second is to use effort for appropriation. Not to produce, but take something. And the difference is based on, while the first concept paradigm is win-win, the second is win-lose. So we took a model of, theoretically, Pedro Miguel, who conceptualized it that 2 groups are based in the fact that are having the same land to farm or to herd. And one group is attacking by the time he assesses the value of peace. And he's seeing it that he will get benefits in taking an advantage of the other. So actually, that's based on what we went, and at the empirical aspect, we went for Heckman model, which we checked the fitness of the model first to our data. So I'm not sure I have the answer for that, but I do agree with you what you are saying, that it's not that I better fight for me to get access of that. For the second attempt of responses for Kodugu, I 100% agree with him that it's very complicated. As for myself, I think, as for now, I don't like to link terrorism to climate change. But experts can say it, but personally I'm learning how to go through that, because it's very much complicated, because the Sahel, we've been experiencing poverty, bad governance, bad neighboring countries, inequalities. They were there in the Sahel. But the Sahel does not experience what it is facing right now. We knew about farmer-herder conflict in the Sahel. We face rebellion, but we don't face one attaching bomb and exploding his own brothers and sisters. So it's very complicated for me to say this is climate change. Surely experts will answer it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Yusuf, do you have something to say about the comment? No?
No, all the comments raised
Okay, good. What about Farmer? Do you have something to say? No. Any comments? More comments? Okay. So I want to thank everybody. It was a pleasure for me to be the chair for this session. Thanks, and we are waiting for the following of the program. Thank you very much.